Welcome back to Sleepy Town Radio, where the nights are quiet, the stories are slow, and the past always has a place to sit beside you. Maybe tonight you're lying in bed with the weight of the day still lingering. Maybe the world feels too fast, too loud, too sharp. So let's go back for a while. Back to a slower America. One with front porches and neighborhood churches, black and white TVs humming in the background, and children playing barefoot in the dusk. I was born in 1948. That means the 1950s were the backdrop to my earliest memories, from toddler to pre-teen. And in those years, the world felt both bigger and smaller than it does now. We didn't lock our doors. We knew our neighbors. And even when things were hard, and they were, we tried to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy. People often ask, was America better back then? And the honest answer is, it depends. It depends on who you were, where you lived, what color your skin was, what battles you were born into and which ones you never saw coming. For some, it was a time of safety, structure, and simpler days. For others, it was a time of silence, of not being seen or heard or allowed to fully live. But either way, it was real. It was human. It was mine. Tonight, I want to tell you what it was like. Not the version you see in old movies or history books, but the one you feel deep down. The one built from little things, the creak of a school desk, the rust on an old pickup, the smell of biscuits on Sunday morning. There were no golden years, only golden moments, and sometimes they were tucked inside ordinary days. So if you're ready, close your eyes, take a breath. Let me tell you what it was really like to grow up in 1950s Louisiana. Back then, marriage was seen as a lifelong promise, not just a partnership, not just a legal bond, but a sacred duty. People didn't talk about falling out of love. They talked about sticking it out, about staying together for the kids, about doing the right thing, even when their hearts were broken behind closed doors. My parents were like that. They didn't have fancy wedding photos or candlelit anniversaries, but they had loyalty, a kind of quiet endurance that's hard to explain to someone who didn't grow up watching it unfold. They had arguments, sure, struggles, but leaving simply wasn't on the table. Part of that, I think, was love. But part of it was also something else, something heavier. Divorce back then carried shame. Not just for the couple, but for the whole family. And for women especially, there weren't many options. Jobs that could support a family were few and far between, and the idea of raising children alone? That was nearly unthinkable, both socially and financially. My mum was strong, stronger than I understood at the time. She dropped out of school to get married, just like so many women did. But when times got hard, she didn't fold. She found work. She took care of us. She stood beside my father even when the railroad cut his hours, even when there wasn't enough money for new shoes or meat for dinner. And that kind of sacrifice, I think that quiet kind of courage, it leaves a mark, even if as a child you don't know how to name it. Family back then wasn't just about love, it was about duty, about carrying your weight and then some, about doing without, together. There were no therapy sessions, no deep conversations about emotional needs. There was just, we do what we have to. And children, well, we weren't the center of the universe the way kids seem to be now. We weren't asked how we felt about things. We were told what to do and expected to do it. But we knew we were loved, not through words, but through action. A packed lunch, a hand on the shoulder, a quiet plate left in the oven if you came home late from school. Nights were spent at the dinner table, all of us sitting down together, whether we wanted to or not. My father said grace, even if we'd already started eating. My mother served herself last, and no one got up until the dishes were cleared. We didn't have much, but what we had felt like enough. The house was small, the meals were simple, the clothes were hand-me-downs, but there was a rhythm to it all, a sense of structure, of security, and that mattered. Of course, now I can see what we didn't talk about. The silence that lived in so many rooms, the swallowed sadness, the compromises women made, the loneliness some couples carried behind tightly drawn curtains. But as a child, you don't see the cracks. You only see the frame, and you believe in it. I think that's why so many people romanticize the 1950s. They remember the feeling of being held in place, of life having rules, expectations, order, but that same structure could be suffocating for those who didn't fit the mold, for those who wanted more or wanted out. Still, there was something tender about the way families moved through hardship together, something strong in the way parents bore their burdens quietly, not because they were perfect, but because they believed that's what love looked like. We didn't say "I love you" much. I don't remember hearing those words often, but I remember the sound of my mother setting her alarm for 4:30 a.m. to start her shift. I remember my father fixing the neighbor's roof on a Saturday, even when his back was killing him. I remember the two of them sitting in the dark, not saying a word, just being together. That was love too, a kind we don't talk about enough. And maybe that's the thing about families back then. They weren't perfect, but they held on, sometimes too tightly, sometimes not enough. But always with the quiet hope that things would be better tomorrow. That was the rhythm of life in those days. Steady, imperfect, enduring. And in that quiet persistence was something beautiful. When I think back on the 1950s, I don't remember hospitals or doctors' offices the way we know them now. Medicine was simpler, cruder in a way, but it was also quieter, more personal, more local. We didn't have urgent care clinics or 24-hour pharmacies. We had one family doctor, and he made house calls. I remember the way his car looked coming down the road, long, wide, and slow. He'd bring his little black bag up the front steps, take off his hat, and come sit beside your bed like a neighbor, not a stranger in a lab coat. But for all the personal touch, we were far behind. Polio was a real fear. Not something we read about in textbooks, but something we whispered about in schoolyards. Children disappeared from classrooms and came back in braces, or didn't come back at all. The vaccine didn't arrive until the middle of the decade. Before that, every summer felt like a game of chance. We didn't know the names of most diseases. There wasn't much talk of things like cancer. Not because it wasn't there, but because people didn't understand it, or they didn't want to. You got sick, you got tired, and eventually you either got better or you didn't. But oddly enough, it didn't feel like we were sick all the time. Maybe because people didn't live long enough to grow old with so many diagnoses, or maybe because we were too busy to notice. The aches and pains were part of the background, part of working, aging, and living life without a cushion. Technology, too, was limited. No digital anything, no beeps, no screens, no monitoring machines. Our thermometer was glass and mercury. Our heating pads plugged into the wall with a thick cotton cord. And if the medicine didn't help, Grandma had a home remedy. A poultice, a boiled root, a prayer. I sometimes wonder if part of why things felt simpler is because we didn't know as much. There's comfort in not knowing the worst. There's quiet in not Googling every symptom. You just trusted your body, or you didn't. But either way, there wasn't much you could do about it. The progress we've made since then is incredible, truly. People live longer now. Diseases that once terrified entire towns are now preventable with a single shot. But with all that progress has come a kind of noise. Constant alerts, constant options, constant fear of what might be lurking beneath the surface. In the 1950s, we didn't have as much, but maybe we weren't quite as afraid of everything. We didn't know how fragile life was, and maybe that was a kind of blessing. I don't think I ever wore a seatbelt as a child. I'm not even sure our car had them. If it did, they were tucked so deep into the seats no one ever used them. Not once. We rode differently back then. I remember standing up in the back seat, leaning over the front bench to watch the road like it was a movie. I'd balance my chin on my father's shoulder as he drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually out the window, cigarette between his fingers. Sometimes we'd ride in the back of a pickup truck, no cover, no straps, just wind and dust and the hum of the tires. We'd wave to strangers, we'd point out cows, we'd let the wind push tears from our eyes as we laughed louder than we had all week. The cars were big, heavy, chrome everywhere, vinyl seats that burned your skin in the summer, AM radios that buzzed with static and baseball games, no airbags, no anti-lock brakes. But we didn't know to be afraid of any of that. We thought we were safe because we were together. I remember long drives at night, the kind where you'd fall asleep stretched out across the back seat, your legs tangled with your siblings, your forehead pressed to a cool window pane. The world would blur into passing headlights and the low murmur of adult conversation from the front. If you woke up halfway, you'd see gas stations glowing like quiet islands in the dark. Your father might stop for a black coffee. Your mother might wrap a blanket over your legs without saying a word. There was something peaceful about riding like that, before GPS, before warning chimes, before the world wrapped us in foam and caution. Back then the road felt open, and we felt invincible. Of course we weren't. The truth is, people died in car accidents far more often. There were no child seats, no crumple zones. A crash could tear through a family. And it did more than once, even in our town. But growing up, you didn't think about those things. You thought about how the wind felt, how far you could go, how the world looked from a car window at 60 miles an hour, endless and promising and impossibly wide. That was childhood in motion. Not safe, not smart maybe, but free. And I think there's something in that memory that still lives inside all of us. That craving for the open road, for a ride where no one's watching the clock or the gas gauge or the rules. Just a long stretch of highway, a car full of family, and the steady hum of moving forward. I grew up in Louisiana, not in the cities, but in the quieter parts. Towns with single stoplights, front porches, and oak trees that had been there longer than any of us. And like so many small towns in the South back then, the lines between people weren't just drawn, they were understood, without question, without discussion. There were coloured-only water fountains, separate waiting rooms, separate schools, separate lives, and no one had to say it out loud. It was in the air, in the way people moved, in the silence that followed certain names being mentioned. I remember walking toward a fountain once, the kind with chipped porcelain and rust around the drain, and being gently but firmly pulled back by my parents. "That's not for you," they whispered. Not with anger, not even with judgment, just with the kind of caution that said, "This is how things are." Looking back now, I realize how wrong it all was, but at the time, it was simply what we knew. Most white folks around me thought of themselves as good, decent people, and many of them were. But they still lived inside a world that taught them to see others as less. Less capable, less clean, less worthy. And yet, when black families passed on the street, there was often a nod, a polite hello. One-on-one, there was a kind of respect, but it was a strange, twisted kind of respect, the kind that only existed so long as everyone knew their place. You didn't see social mixing, not really. No shared lunches, no mixed classrooms, no overlapping friend groups. It wasn't hate in the streets. It was a quiet, suffocating kind of separation. And that's what made it last so long. It didn't shout, it whispered. And those whispers shaped entire lives. Still there were moments, small ones, that hinted at change. A few white teachers questioning the system, a few kids asking why things were the way they were. And a growing sense, even in our little town, that the old ways were cracking just a bit around the edges. I was just a boy then, so I didn't understand the full weight of it. But I could feel it in the uneasiness of certain conversations, in the glances exchanged when someone said too much. I never heard much discrimination toward Jews or immigrants where I lived. But Cajuns, folks who spoke French, dressed a little different, acted a little different, were sometimes looked at as lesser too. Not with cruelty, but with that same quiet dismissal that hung in the air. The kind that tells a person you don't quite belong. It's strange to think about now how normalized it all was. The Sunday sermons, the school rules, the local customs, they all played a part in keeping the world divided. And unless you stepped outside of it, unless you really looked, you didn't see it clearly. That's the thing about growing up in the South back then. You could be surrounded by injustice and never feel like you were doing anything wrong. You were just living the life you were handed without ever being asked to question it. And for those who did question it, who marched, who spoke up, who refused to sit in silence, they were the ones who helped turn the tide. Slowly, painfully, But surely I don't look back on that time with pride, but I do look back with clarity, because if we're going to remember the past honestly, we can't leave out the parts that made us uncomfortable. The truth has to be bigger than nostalgia. And the truth is, for all its beauty, for all its slow summer nights and kind neighbors, the world I grew up in wasn't fair to everyone, not even close. School in the 1950s was different. Simpler in some ways, stricter in others, but always serious. We didn't have security cameras or metal detectors, but we had presence. Teachers stood tall back then, not just physically, but in spirit. When they walked into a room, it felt like something had shifted. Even the air got quieter. You didn't call your teacher by their first name. You didn't talk back. You didn't chew gum or slouch or ask, "Why do we have to learn this?" You just did the work. And if you didn't, there were consequences. Swift and sure. I remember one time, back in 7th grade, I was in shop class. Wood shavings on the floor, the smell of motor oil in the air. Our teacher had a rule. No one was to touch the power tools unless he was in the room. Simple, clear, and understood. One day he stepped out for just a moment, and an older boy, a few years ahead of us, came in and flipped on the table saw. We didn't stop him. Maybe we were scared. Maybe we thought it wasn't our place. But when the teacher returned and found out, he didn't yell. He just looked disappointed. That was worse. As a consequence, he gave each of us one whack with a modified baseball bat. Sawed down the sides. Just one. Not enough to hurt, really, but enough to make a point. Enough to stick with you. And not just because of the sting, but because of the feeling that we'd let someone down, someone we respected. Teachers were trusted in those days. By students, by parents. If you got in trouble at school, you were in bigger trouble when you got home. There was no arguing with the principal, no angry phone calls. Your folks would take the teacher's word as truth, and that was that. But with that authority came responsibility. And most of the teachers I knew wore it well. They weren't in it for glory or money. They were there because they believed in what they did. They wanted to see kids learn, grow, become better than what the world told them they could be. We didn't have fancy technology or group projects or open-floor classrooms. We had chalkboards, cursive, multiplication drills, and a healthy fear of being called on when you weren't paying attention. But we also had moments. Quiet encouragement, a pat on the back. A teacher staying after school to help you with long division. Those little things that told you you mattered. And for all the strictness, I think that's what made it work. There was structure, there was respect, and in between the rules and the routines, there was care. If the 1950s were anything, they were structured. There was a way to be, a mold to fit, a blueprint for how to look, how to act, how to belong. Boys kept their hair short. Girls wore dresses to school. You said, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am." You went to church on Sundays, stood for the anthem, and never, ever made a scene. And if you didn't quite fit that pattern, life could feel very lonely. There was very little room for difference, whether it was the way you talked, the clothes you wore, or the quiet questions you carried inside. Anything outside the lines was quietly pushed back in. I remember the hush that came over a room when someone didn't play by the rules. Maybe a boy let his hair grow past his collar. Maybe a girl didn't quite smile the way she was supposed to. Maybe someone walked a little softer, spoke a little slower, didn't laugh at the same jokes. People noticed. They didn't always say anything out loud, but you could feel it. Back then, to be gay, or even suspected of it, was to walk a tightrope. There were whispers, cruel jokes, doors that closed before you ever knocked. I knew a man like that. He was a Boy Scout leader, someone adults seemed to trust, but behind closed doors, there were darker stories. I later learned that he had hurt some boys, including someone I knew. It was handled quietly. No headlines. No justice that I ever saw. Just silence. A silence that echoed far too long. And yet, even outside of that darkness, I could feel how hard it was for anyone who didn't quite fit the mold. Not because they were bad or broken, but because the world had no space carved out for them. You could live among us, but not with us. Not fully. Not openly. People said things like, they just keep to themselves, or they're a little different, but harmless. As if tolerance was the best they could offer. In private, there was ridicule. In public, there was distance. And in between, there was a lot of pretending. I think about that sometimes, about how many lives were lived halfway, hidden under polite smiles and carefully chosen words. How much loneliness was dressed up as quiet dignity. The world today is far from perfect. But there is, at least, more room now. More language. More light. And maybe more kindness. Back then, being different meant being invisible. And for those who couldn't, or wouldn't, disappear, the price was high. But even in those days, I like to think that somewhere in all that silence, some of us were beginning to listen. My family didn't have much. Most folks we knew didn't. But back then, poverty didn't always look like hunger or homelessness. Sometimes it just meant second-hand shoes, patched shirts, and dinner made from whatever was left in the pantry. My father left school in the 7th grade. The Depression hit hard, and like so many boys of that time, he stepped into manhood before he ever had the chance to be a teenager. He worked the railroad, long hours, dangerous conditions, paychecks that could vanish with a strike or a layoff. He didn't complain. He didn't talk about dreams. He just worked, quietly, faithfully, because that's what men did back then. They carried the weight, even when it bent them. My mother didn't finish school either. She dropped out to get married. That's what many women did, not because they lacked ambition, but because that was the path laid out in front of them. But when hard times came, she didn't flinch. She found work. First small things, then more. Eventually, she landed a job at AT&T, the phone company. She started at the very bottom, but she didn't stay there. They saw something in her. Not just intelligence, but resilience. She earned her GED. She learned fast. She led with grace. By the time she retired, she was one of the top women in the state, a district-level manager reporting directly to a corporate vice president. No college degree. No connections, just grit, talent, and a work ethic you could see from a mile away. I didn't understand it fully at the time, what it took for her to climb that ladder. But looking back, I see it clearer than ever. In a world that wasn't built for women to lead, she led anyway. And through it all, the tight budgets, the layoffs, the early mornings and long commutes, she never let us feel poor. We had what we needed: a roof, food, clean clothes, a mother who believed in more. That belief was contagious. It planted something in me. A quiet fire that said, "You can do better, you will do better." I became the first in my family, on either side, to earn a college degree, and I wasn't alone in that. Across the country, in little towns like mine, whole generations were breaking cycles, not because life got easier, but because someone before them refused to give up. That's what I remember most about those years. Not the struggle, but the determination. The way people kept going, kept showing up, kept choosing hope, even when it was hard to find. We didn't have much, but we had enough. And sometimes, enough is all it takes to build something better. I don't think my parents ever said the word college out loud when I was a kid. It wasn't that they didn't believe in it, it just felt far away. Like something meant for other families, not for people like us. But slowly, quietly, things began to shift. Doors cracked open, programs were created, tuition stayed low. And in places like Louisiana, where the cost of living was modest and community colleges were growing, something new became possible. I still remember the day I packed my bags. A beat-up suitcase, a few textbooks, and more nerves than I let on. I wasn't just the first in my family to go to college. I was the first to even finish high school. It wasn't fancy. I lived in a tiny dorm with peeling paint and paper-thin walls. Meals were cheap, classes were tough, and money was always tight. I worked part-time as a lab assistant, microscopes by day, textbooks by night, but it was enough. It was possible, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the world might stretch out further than the town I came from. Back then, college didn't mean drowning in debt. It didn't mean needing scholarships or perfect grades. It meant working hard, eating simple, studying when everyone else went out. It meant believing, even when you didn't quite know what came next. I finished my degree in just over 2.5 years. No loans, no fanfare, just quiet pride. The kind that settles deep into your bones and stays there. I wasn't alone. Across the country, people like me, sons and daughters of rail workers and factory hands, secretaries and seamstresses, were stepping into classrooms and carving out something new. We weren't trying to chase some big American dream. We were just trying to do a little better than those who came before us, and to honor the sacrifices that made it possible. My mum never got to walk across a stage in cap and gown, but when I did, she was right there in the front row, hands clasped, eyes shining, and I knew, in that moment, the diploma had both our names on it. That's what college was for me. Not just a piece of paper, not a ticket to a better job, but proof. Proof that change was possible, that grit could beat circumstance, that education wasn't just for the privileged few, not then anyway. And maybe that's the part I miss most about those years, when dreams didn't have to be perfect, just possible. Was America better in the 1950s? I suppose it depends on where you stood. If you were white, straight, and followed the rules, life probably felt predictable, safe. maybe even sweet. But if you fell outside the lines, if you asked too many questions or wanted too many things, then the world could feel like a wall with no door. That's the truth of it. The part that doesn't make it into postcards or vintage signs. The 50s weren't some flawless paradise. They were human, messy, full of contradiction. There was beauty. So much beauty. Sunday dinners with your whole family around the table, the smell of cut grass in summer, radios humming in kitchens, doors left unlocked, teachers who knew your name. A slower rhythm of life where small joys had room to breathe. But alongside that there was silence, there was inequality, there was pain carried in private, and dreams set aside without ever being spoken. I don't tell these stories because I want to go back. I tell them because they were real, because they shaped us, because they deserve to be remembered. Not just the good parts, but the complicated ones too. Memory has a soft light to it. It rounds the corners, fades the harshness. But underneath that warmth is something solid, a truth that still matters. We didn't have everything back then, but we had enough. Enough to build with. Enough to believe in. Enough to keep going. And maybe in the end, that's what mattered most. Not whether it was better or worse, but that it was. That it was lived deeply and fully by people doing their best with what they had. If you're still awake, thank you for staying with me, for listening, for remembering. Maybe something in this story reminded you of your own. Maybe it brought back a smell, a sound, a name you hadn't thought of in years. If so, I hope you hold it close. Let it settle beside you like an old friend. The past isn't perfect, but it's ours. And tonight, that's more than enough. Thanks for spending the night with Sleepy Town Radio. Sweet dreams. And we'll see you next time.